Most people do not fail at compounding because they are stupid. They fail because they mistake the runway for the flight. They stare at the first 12 months, see almost no lift, and conclude the engine is broken. Then they step off the runway 1 hour before the machine would have started carrying its own weight. I have spent my life watching people misunderstand money in exactly this way. They think wealth begins when the account looks impressive. I think wealth begins much earlier. At the moment you stop demanding applause from the early stage. The ugliest truth in investing is that the first years often feel insulting. You save, you buy, you wait, the market wiggles up, down, sideways, the number barely moves, the sacrifice feels visible. The progress does not. That is where most people surrender, not in a crash, not in a recession and boredom. That is the real trap. A great many people never become owners because they need proof too early. They need the first $100 to feel powerful. They need the first year to feel transformative. They need the graph to flatter their ego before the math has had time to do anything useful. Money does not work that way. A runway is not a waste of concrete because the plane has not lifted in the first 10 seconds. The runway exists precisely because heavy things need distance before they rise. Wealth works the same way. If you do not understand the runway, you never reach the air. Here is the number most people should tattoo on their financial imagination. A massive share of lifetime investment growth often hides in the later years, not the early ones. The final stretch does not look a little better. It looks unfairly better. That is why the beginning feels so deceptive. You are doing the right thing while being paid almost nothing emotionally. Ordinary people hate that arrangement. The worker mind wants an immediate transaction. I did the thing. Now hand me the reward. The owner mind is different. The owner is willing to look underpaid for a long time while building the machine that later overpays him. That difference is everything. Let me give you a simple case because abstract money talk ruins people. When finance becomes too polished, too elegant, too theoretical, the ordinary person tunes it out. So let us talk about a man close to the bottom of the American middle, because that is where most financial courage is actually tested. Picture a man in his mid-20s answering calls in a noisy customer support center. He earns around $43,400 a year before tax. After the deductions and payroll drag, roughly $2,619 lands in his checking account each month. Rent takes $1,153, groceries and transport chew through another $800 and change. Then there is the ordinary friction of being alive, soap, gas replacing something that broke, a friend's birthday, one stupid subscription you forgot to cancel. Most months $50 or $60 remain. Not freedom, not security, barely air. Now I want you to notice something important. That man does not need a lecture about asset allocation. First, he does not need a genius stock idea. He does not need somebody yelling at him about abundance. He needs a runway that fits his actual life. So he does something that looks almost too small to matter. He sets up a tiny automatic purchase into a plain index fund, not a heroic promise, not some fantasy number chosen to impress a spreadsheet, just $37 a month, scheduled after the main bills clear. That number is laughable to the wrong kind of person. The wrong kind of person always laughs at small beginnings. They confuse size with seriousness. They think the amount proves the commitment. I have found the opposite to be true. The amount that survives is more valuable than the amount that excites you for 3 weeks and disappears. The first function of a contribution is not growth, it is continuity. That is a phrase worth remembering. Continuity beats intensity in the runway stage. Month 1, the account looks ridiculous. One small purchase, a little market noise, maybe it is up $1 one day, down 3, the next emotionally it feels absurd. He can almost taste the takeout meals he could have bought instead. Month 3, it is the same story. The balance crawls past $100 and dances around it like a weak signal on a broken radio. The financial media screams about inflation, rates, war, rallies, sell-offs, and every other headline factory designed to make a novice feel late, afraid, and stupid. This is what I call the boredom tax. The boredom tax is the emotional price you pay before compounding becomes visible. Nobody warns you about this honestly enough. They tell you the market compounds. They tell you to start early. They tell you time matters. All true. But they rarely tell you that the first stage feels so underwhelming that your own mind becomes the biggest enemy in the room. You begin asking foolish questions. Is this even worth it? Should I wait until I can invest a real amount? Would I be better off enjoying life now and starting properly later? That last sentence has ruined more futures than bad stock picks. Later is a liar. Later always arrives with new bills, new preferences, new excuses, and a stronger appetite for comfort. If you cannot carry a tiny discipline today, you usually do not become the person who carries a larger one tomorrow. What grows first is not the account. What grows first is your capacity to keep a promise to your future self. That is why I've never respected the casual attitude people have towards small sums. A small sum handled correctly is evidence of character. A large sum handled badly is just a countdown. So the young man does something even more important than opening the account. He removes emotion from the ritual. For the first year, he does not ask the account to inspire him. He treats that $37 like rent. It leaves the debate as over. It is not a monthly referendum. It is not a mood. It is not a motivational event. It is part of the plumbing. This is the runway discipline, when you are still on the ground. The last thing you want is a pilot who keeps turning off the engines to save fuel every 5 minutes around the middle of the year. The account passes $250. That number will not impress anyone on social media. It should not. Social media is an outer scorecard machine. It teaches people to worship visible status and ignore invisible architecture. But for this man, crossing 250 matters because for the first time in his adult life, there is a line on his net worth chart moving in the correct direction without being immediately devoured by consumption. Then life does what life always does. It punches him in the mouth. The car needs repair. The estimate is just under $500. In an old pattern, he would liquidate the tiny investment account, call the experiment unrealistic, and go right back to living from paycheck shock to paycheck shock. Instead, he works extra shifts. He sells an old gaming console. He covers the repair and leaves the investment account untouched. Now we are no longer talking about money. Now we are talking about identity. This is the identity firewall. Until you create a firewall between your present panic and your future capital, you do not own investments. You merely rent them until the next inconvenience arrives. People love to talk about return on capital. Fine, I care a great deal about it. But before return on capital comes respect for capital. If your money can be rated by every passing discomfort, your portfolio is not a portfolio. It is a glorified savings puddle with delusions. That distinction matters because the early years are not rich in visible gains. They are rich in habit formation. The numbers may be unimpressive. The architecture is not. At the end of the first year, this young man has put in $444 of his own money, depending on ordinary market movement. Maybe the account sits around $469. He made roughly enough in gain to cover one grocery run. If a cynical friend looked over his shoulder, he would smirk. 12 months of discipline for that. Yes, because the cynic is measuring the wrong thing. He is measuring applause. I am measuring runway. The first year of compounding is not there to make you feel rich. It is there to teach you that ownership can become automatic. That is a far more important achievement than making $25 in profit. The $25 is not the point. The point is that a person who used to consume every spare dollar now has a system that routes part of life toward the future without begging for permission each month. That is not a small change. That is a change in operating identity. In the second year, something subtle happens. He does not suddenly become aggressive. He does not declare a brand new life chapter. He simply nudges the monthly amount whenever overtime or a pay raise gives him a little room. 37 becomes 42, 42 becomes 49, then 53. Those tiny adjustments look trivial to people addicted to dramatic stories, but that is because dramatic people usually do not understand machines. A good machine improves by small calibrated adjustments, not by theatrical declarations. By the end of the second year, the man has deposited a little over $1,100 in total. Maybe the account reads something around 1229, give or take. The gain is still not large enough to change his lifestyle. But the psychological structure is changing fast. He can now see a small but real gap between what he put in and what the account reports. That gap matters more than the size suggests. I call this the second worker effect. When you are young and financially fragile, every dollar seems to come from one place only: your labor, your back, your attention, your time. Then one day the account produces something while you are sleeping, commuting, or too tired to think. It is not much yet, but it is enough to introduce a dangerous idea. Maybe I do not need to do all the lifting forever. That idea is the beginning of financial adulthood. A very old book expressed the principle in simple language. Pay yourself first. People think that phrase is cute. It is not cute. It is one of the few rules that survives almost every era because it solves a timeless problem. The world sends invoices to your attention the moment money arrives. If you wait to see what remains, the world wins. If you route a slice to ownership before the crowd gets access to it, your future begins building while your present is still noisy. That is why automatic investing is not just convenience. It is self-defense. You must understand the enemy clearly. The enemy is not only low income, the enemy is not only inflation, the enemy is not only bad habits, the enemy is the daily auction for your capital. Everyone wants a slice of it before it can become independent. Landlords, advertisers, subscription businesses, status games, convenience culture, impulse merchants, short-term dopamine, and your own tired brain all show up with a handout. If you do not build a routing rule, you do not have a plan. You have prey. By year 5, the picture still would not impress the impatient. Maybe the monthly contribution has climbed to around $112. Maybe the total deposited sits somewhere above $5,300. Maybe the account is just under $6,400. The gain, roughly $1,000, still looks small relative to all the discipline, all the restraint, all the years. An unserious person will still shrug at this stage. That person is still measuring altitude from the cabin window before the plane has even cleared the weather. The better question is this: what changed beneath the surface? Almost everything. The young man now has proof that he can stay in the game through boredom. He has proof that a surprise expense does not automatically kill the system. He has proof that small income increases can be redirected instead of evaporating. Most importantly, he has proof that early dollars have a special power that later dollars will never fully replicate. This is a hard concept for many people because the early dollars are smaller. They look weaker. In reality, they often do the heaviest lifting. Why? Because they get the most runway. A dollar invested at 26 has more time to multiply, split, reinvest, and multiply again than a dollar invested at 36 or 46. The first dollars do not look impressive at birth. They become powerful because they accumulate miles. Time is not a backdrop in investing. Time is the amplifier. That is why I tell people something they do not enjoy hearing. If you are waiting until the amount feels meaningful, you are surrendering the most productive years to your own discomfort. You are standing at the end of the runway insisting you will start accelerating once the plane is already in the sky. That is impossible around year 8 or 9. The shape starts to change. This is the moment the textbooks make look easy and real life makes feel miraculous. Total deposits might be around 11,000 and change. The account might show 15 or 16,000. Suddenly the gap is no longer symbolic. It can pay for a used car. It can cover months of rent in a strong period. The portfolio might grow by more in a year than the man contributes from labor. Now the machine feels alive, but let me be very precise. The market did not become magical that year. The math did not invent a new rule. The investor crossed an invisible line. For long years he was mostly pushing the plane down the runway. Then one day thrust and speed reached a point where the machine began to carry more of its own load. I call this the liftoff line. Most people never experience the liftoff line because they resigned during the taxi phase. This is one of the most brutal patterns in personal finance. People demand emotional satisfaction from a process whose payoff is delayed by design. Then, when the payoff finally begins to arrive, they are no longer in the seat. You see the same thing in business. Somebody plants a seed, waters it, gets no meaningful feedback for a discouraging stretch, and quits 3 feet before the economics change. Then they tell the next person the model does not work. The model was fine. Your patience failed. By year 10 or 11, the young man from the call center can have a truly disorienting experience. In a good market year, the account may rise by $3,000 or $4,000 without any heroic action on his part. That number may exceed what he once saved across entire years of labor. Think about what happened there. His present self is still working, but his past decisions have become a force multiplier. Earlier discipline has turned into present support. The runway did its job. The plane is finally flying. That is the handoff. The handoff is when your past self starts working harder than your present self. This is the stage almost everyone fantasizes about and almost nobody respects enough in the beginning. They want the handoff without the runway. They want altitude without friction. They want ownership without delayed gratification. That is not investing. That is wishing. The handoff also changes the nature of the battle in the early years. The challenge is to keep the system alive. In the later years, the challenge is to protect altitude. That means resisting lifestyle inflation, protecting your savings rate when income rises, avoiding the temptation to perform wealth before you actually possess freedom, and refusing to sabotage the machine because someone around you looks louder, newer, or shinier. You need an inner scorecard here. When the people around you move into nicer apartments a little early, you will feel pressure. When coworkers finance a car that shouts success, you will feel pressure. When old friends tell you that you should enjoy life more because you are finally doing better, you will feel pressure. This is where many investors quietly puncture their own tires, not because the market beat them, because social gravity beat them. Social gravity is stronger than most spreadsheets admit. You must decide whose standards you live under. If you live under the outer scorecard, you will always feel late. There will always be somebody with a better vacation, a cleaner kitchen, a more flattering car payment, a more photogenic lifestyle. If you live under the inner scorecard, the questions are different. Is my machine getting stronger? Is my future gaining more options? Is my stress less purchased by debt and more buffered by capital? Is my life becoming easier to control? Those are investor questions. Most people ask consumer questions and wonder why they never become owners. Here is another truth the culture hides badly. Wealth is what you do not see. The strongest financial years of a serious person often look unimpressive from the outside. Quiet apartment, normal clothes, ordinary car. Small pleasures chosen deliberately, not reflexively. Boring automatic contributions. Long stretches with no story to tell. Meanwhile, underground, the roots are spreading, the machine is taking load off the worker, the runway is being converted into altitude, the culture celebrates visible motion, compounding rewards, invisible consistency. If you want the outcome, you must learn to love the invisibility. That does not mean live like a monk. I have no interest in financial theater of another kind, where people turn prudence into vanity. The goal is not deprivation for its own sake. The goal is chosen enjoyment instead of automatic leakage. In the case of our young worker, life still contains treats. He still eats out sometimes. He still buys something unnecessary once in a while. But the order changed. The future gets paid before the present starts negotiating. That order is civilization at the personal level. Somewhere in this journey, he also discovers a vital truth about small raises. Most people spend raises as if life were already entitled to them. The wiser move is to split the raise before your lifestyle notices. If monthly investing rises by $5 here, $7 there, $10 after a better roll or extra hours, the machine strengthens without creating panic. That is how ordinary incomes build extraordinary outcomes. Not with one giant sacrificial act, but with a series of quiet reroutes. This is why I distrust all or nothing thinking in personal finance. The man who insists he will start when he can invest $500 a month often never starts. The person who begins with 29 and protects the habit may eventually reach 500 without drama. The runway does not need to be glamorous. It needs to be long enough and uninterrupted enough. A useful phrase here is sacred minimum. Your sacred minimum is the amount small enough to survive bad months and boring enough to repeat. If that number is $29, fine. If it is 37, fine. The sacred minimum is not there to prove strength. It is there to preserve identity. You guard it because once the line breaks, restarting is much harder than continuing. This matters because life does not arrive in a neat chart. Cars break, hours get cut, teeth crack, rent rises, energy falls, families need help. Your future wealth is built not in the absence of interruption, but in your response to interruption. Can you keep ownership alive while the rest of life is noisy? That question separates those who eventually experience liftoff from those who remain permanent passengers. I also want to speak to the emotional confusion of the middle years because that phase is underappreciated. The beginning is obviously tiny. The later years are obviously powerful. The middle is dangerous because it is promising but not yet dominant. The account is no longer trivial, but it still does not feel like freedom. This is where people get greedy, restless, and vulnerable to nonsense. They want to speed the process up. They start flirting with fashionable trades, options, excitement, hot stories, and concentrated bets. They do not understand. They have survived the runway, then wrecked the plane because cruising altitude feels too slow. This is another form of impatience. Impatience is not only quitting early. Impatience is also abandoning a sound machine because you became offended by its normal speed. I have seen more money destroyed by wounded ego than by poor arithmetic. The man in our example stays plain. He keeps buying broad ownership. He keeps adjusting contributions upward when real life permits. He resists the need to entertain himself with financial drama. That decision matters. A great compounding record is usually boring in the middle. The drama comes later when the accumulated result looks almost impossible to people who never saw the years of dull repetition. That is why simple investing books have survived for so long. Different authors, different personalities, same core drumbeat start, keep going, ignore noise, let time perform, pay yourself first. None of these rules sound sophisticated. That is because sophistication is often the perfume people spray on insecurity. The basics look plain because they are true. I built my own fortune through patience and ownership, not through constant excitement. I did not need a casino. I needed good assets, rational behavior, and time. The average person does not need to imitate my exact path, but they do need to understand the principle. You do not become free because the first few years feel exciting. You become free because you remained on the runway long enough for ordinary compounding to become extraordinary. And let me be blunt about one more thing. Salary alone is a fragile strategy. It is linear. It depends on your continued output, continued health, continued employability, and continued willingness to trade time for cash. There is nothing immoral about working for wages. Nearly everyone begins there. The problem is staying there mentally forever. If every dollar in your life must be earned again by labor, then you are one interruption away from anxiety. Ownership changes the equation. Ownership introduces help. Ownership creates the possibility that a piece of your life is being carried by assets rather than by your immediate exhaustion. That is why a small investment account matters more than its size suggests. It is not just an account. It is the first tiny rebellion against total dependence on labor. The rebellion looks pathetic at first. So did many worthwhile things. When the world measures you by visible consumption, quiet ownership can feel lonely. Your peers may seem to be enjoying the game more. They spend without guilt. They upgrade on schedule. They treat every raise like permission. They finance appearances because appearances produce social warmth immediately. Meanwhile, you are buying an invisible future and getting almost no applause for it. Good. That is the price of admission. If the crowd loved the runway stage, everyone would become financially independent. They do not. So the reward goes to the minority who can tolerate the silence. Silence is underrated capital. A person who can operate without constant validation has a massive advantage in markets and in life. He can keep buying when nothing feels exciting. He can keep waiting when the timeline offends him. He can decline the social circus. He can let the machine work. If you cannot bear silence, you will sabotage compounding because compounding whispers for a very long time before it speaks loudly. Let us return to the hidden mathematics because this is where the whole story becomes concrete. The first dollars matter disproportionately because they get more cycles. $1 saved early may double multiple times across a lifetime. A later dollar may only double once or twice. So the early contributions, which felt tiny, often become the pillars holding up the later structure. This is why people who delay for 10 years are not simply missing 10 years of deposits. They are missing the most fertile years of multiplication. This is also why the first decade feels psychologically backward. The decade that creates the possibility of large future gains is the very decade in which gains look least impressive. That is a cruel design. If you need emotional encouragement, it is a beautiful design. If you understand what game you are in, you are not buying present excitement, you are buying future asymmetry. At some point, the machine can do something almost surreal. The growth in the account over a month or a year begins to exceed what you contribute from your paycheck. That is the moment many people suddenly say, "Now I get it." But the truth is, they do not suddenly get a new principle. They finally see the old principle in a visible form. The law was always there. Their eyes were the part that was late. That is why I tell people not to judge compounding by the first chapter. The first chapter is setup. The second chapter is character testing. The third chapter is habit reinforcement. Only later do you reach the chapters where the economics feel generous. If you walk out after the opening act, do not complain that the story lacked a payoff. And yes, there will be ugly stretches. Markets do not rise in a neat line. Some years will feel like an insult. There will be drawdowns that make you question whether the machine has reversed. There will be news cycles that tell you this time is different and the old rules are dead. Most of that noise is just turbulence. The pilot who understands the runway and the aircraft does not abandon the plane because the cabin shook for a while. He stays with the process because he knows what carries him and what merely frightens him. That is another reason the system must be simple. Complexity is seductive at the beginning because it flatters the ego. Simplicity wins over long stretches because it survives real life. A broad index fund, automatic purchases, gradual increases, restraint when income rises, and a refusal to raid the machine every time life gets annoying. That does not sound flashy. Neither does oxygen. Do not confuse basic with weak. The strongest financial structures I know are often built from repeatable basics executed for a long time. This is also why I prefer people to focus on protecting the system more than maximizing the amount in the early stage. Protect the automatic transfer, protect the identity firewall, protect the sacred minimum, protect the separation between your checking account and your ownership account. Protect the habit of increasing contributions when income grows. Protect the refusal to perform wealth before the machine is ready. Those protections matter more than arguing over minor differences in return assumptions while the actual system remains fragile. Too many people act like amateur engineers arguing about horsepower while the plane still has holes in the wings. Fix the structure first. Now let me tell you what the end of this journey really offers, because it is not just a larger number. A stronger portfolio changes the emotional texture of life. It buys time before panic. It lowers the cortisol of uncertainty. It makes job loss less catastrophic. It turns bad luck from a life event into a financial inconvenience. It gives you the right to say no more often. Refusal power is one of the highest forms of wealth. The ability to refuse a humiliating job, a stupid loan, a manipulative boss, a desperate choice, a reckless partnership, a high-pressure sell. Capital gives dignity because capital buys time and time gives judgment room. But refusal power is built in silence. You do not wake up with it because you read a quote and opened an app. You build it by surviving the years when almost nothing about the process feels glamorous. So if you're sitting there with an income that feels ordinary, a budget that feels tight, and a voice in your head telling you that your first $30 or $50 a month cannot possibly matter, I want you to challenge that voice with a better question. Not, will this make me rich next year? Ask, am I willing to build a runway long enough for liftoff? That is the real question. If you say yes, then the first step is not to impress anybody. The first step is to choose an amount that fits reality and automate it. Then stop asking that amount to entertain you. Let it be boring. Let it be plain. Let it disappear on schedule. When income rises, Give the machine a few more dollars before your lifestyle touches them. When bad luck arrives, do everything reasonable to protect the line. And when the numbers look embarrassingly small in the beginning, remind yourself that the early stage was never built to flatter you. It was built to test whether you deserve the later stage, because that is what the runway really is. It is not dead distance. It is a test of seriousness. Anyone can dream about altitude. Very few people can tolerate acceleration before the reward becomes visible. Very few people can stay seated when the cabin still looks ordinary. Very few people can watch years of small numbers and keep believing the machine is doing its job. But that minority is exactly who compounding rewards. One day, if you hold the line long enough, you will open an account and the growth will feel out of proportion to the effort you made that month, in that moment. You will be tempted to think the miracle happened overnight. It did not. The miracle was built in dozens of invisible decisions made when nothing felt magical. It was built when you chose ownership over impulse, continuity over intensity, silence over showmanship, the inner scorecard over the outer one, and the runway over the fantasy of instant flight. That is when you discover a brutal but liberating truth. Wealth does not belong to the most excited person in the room. It belongs to the person who can look foolish, feel under-rewarded, and keep the engines running long enough for the sky to finally take over. So here is the test. Will you keep demanding proof from the first months and first years and spend the rest of your life walking because the runway offended your ego? Or will you accept that almost every meaningful financial flight begins with friction, noise, and very little visible progress, and keep moving until your past self starts carrying your present one? That door is in front of you. Most people turn away because the ground feels too ordinary. The few who understand the runway walk through it, keep accelerating, and someday realize they are no longer fighting gravity at all.